Did I do something wrong?
No, we've been looking for you for almost a month. One quiet decision you made saved far more than a stranger's life.
Rain tapped softly against the windows of Susan Miller's tiny Chicago apartment when an unexpected knock interrupted the silence. Standing outside was a gray-haired lawyer holding a faded blue envelope, the exact kind Susan had quietly used weeks earlier to hide a hospital receipt no one was ever supposed to trace back to her. He looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Miss Miller, we've been looking for you for almost a month. One quiet decision you made saved far more than a stranger's life." Susan's heart stopped. She had only paid a hospital bill. So why was a lawyer standing at her door? Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If stories about ordinary kindness changing extraordinary lives speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter. 3 weeks earlier, before the rain, before the lawyer, before anyone uttered the words that would forever change Susan Miller's life, Tuesday morning began at exactly 4:30 a.m. The alarm on her old, flip-style bedside clock buzzed with the same tired persistence it had every weekday for nearly 7 years. Susan reached over without opening her eyes and silenced it before the second buzz. She had learned long ago that waking up gently was a luxury reserved for people who slept through the night. She had just finished another 12-hour shift at Mercy General Hospital on Chicago's west side. The apartment was barely 600 square feet tucked into the third floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. The radiator hissed louder than it heated. The kitchen light flickered every few minutes. A tiny crack stretched across the living room window, one she had covered with clear tape before winter arrived. Yet everything inside was spotless. The dishes were always washed before she went to bed. Shoes rested neatly beside the front door. A small fern sat on the windowsill despite receiving almost no sunlight. Order was one thing Susan could still control. She shuffled into the kitchen wearing faded gray sweatpants and an oversized hospital sweatshirt with the sleeves rolled to her wrists. Instead of brewing expensive coffee, she carefully measured 1 spoonful of ground coffee into a dented French press she had owned for over a decade. Every scoop mattered. While the coffee steeped, she opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. Behind a stack of paper plates sat a pale blue envelope. She took it down carefully. Inside were crisp $20 bills, a few tens, and several fives folded with almost mathematical precision. $2,384. She counted it every Tuesday. Not because she expected the amount to change overnight, because seeing the number reminded her that she was getting closer. Closer to repairing her car, closer to ending the daily anxiety that followed every strange engine noise. Closer to believing that one unexpected expense wouldn't completely unravel her life. She smiled faintly before sliding the money back into the envelope. Just a little longer, she whispered to herself. The blue envelope disappeared back into its hiding place. Coffee in hand, Susan stood by the kitchen window watching dawn slowly push away the darkness. Chicago looked strangely peaceful from her apartment. A city that could feel merciless during the day often appeared almost gentle before sunrise. For 5 quiet minutes, she allowed herself to believe life was standing still. Then reality arrived. Her phone vibrated. Emily Ross. Susan smiled before answering. "You made it home?" Emily asked without greeting. "I've been home 6 minutes." "I knew it. You timed me." "I know your routine better than you do." Susan laughed softly. Emily had worked beside her for almost 5 years. They shared impossible shifts, skipped lunches together, celebrated recoveries, mourned losses, and somehow managed to laugh between emergencies. "You sound exhausted," Emily said. "I am." "Go to sleep." "I will." "You always say that." "I mean it this time." Emily sighed dramatically. "Promise me one thing." "What?" If your car makes that horrible rattling sound again, don't drive it. Susan looked towards the apartment parking lot. Her silver 2007 Toyota Corolla sat exactly where she had left it. The paint had faded years ago. A patch of rust hugged one wheel well. The driver's seat leaned slightly to one side. The check engine light had become such a permanent fixture that she barely noticed it anymore. "It'll survive another week," Susan replied. Emily remained silent. "Susan, I know." "No, I really do know." "You've been saying that for 6 months." Susan didn't answer, because Emily was right. The mechanic had already warned her twice. The suspension was failing. The brakes would soon need replacing. The transmission leaked slowly. Every repair had been postponed because something else always demanded money first. Rent, utilities, medical insurance, groceries, student loan payments she was still making despite graduating nursing school nearly 15 years earlier. When people imagined nurses, they often imagined comfortable salaries and stable lives. Susan sometimes wished they could spend 1 month balancing her budget. They would quickly discover how thin stability could feel. "You still saving?" Emily asked gently. Susan glanced toward the hidden envelope. "Almost there." Emily smiled through the phone. "I'm proud of you." Those simple words stayed with Susan after the call ended. No one had told her they were proud of her in a very long time. She finally lay down around 5:15. Outside, garbage trucks rumbled through the streets. Somewhere downstairs, a baby cried. A neighbor argued loudly over the phone. The city never truly slept. Neither, it sometimes seemed, did Susan. She woke again shortly after noon. Her next shift began at 3. That left enough time for laundry, grocery shopping, and hopefully another hour of rest. The grocery store sat only 4 blocks away. Susan carried a handwritten list folded inside her jacket pocket. Milk, eggs, bread, rice, frozen vegetables, peanut butter, bananas, nothing extra. At the checkout counter, she placed each item carefully onto the conveyor belt. The cashier smiled politely. "Found everything? I did." The total came to $63.17. Susan quietly removed 2 yogurts from the order. "Actually, I don't need these." The cashier nodded without comment. Susan appreciated that. Dignity often survived through silence. Outside, she loaded the groceries into the Corolla. The engine hesitated before starting. Then came the sound. Clunk, rattle, metal scraping softly beneath the floor. Susan closed her eyes. "Not today," she whispered. The car pulled away anyway. At every red light, she listened carefully. Every new vibration felt like another warning. She parked behind Mercy General 20 minutes before her shift. The employee parking lot was already half full. As she stepped out, she noticed an elderly janitor struggling with 2 heavy trash bins. Without saying anything, Susan walked over. "I've got one." "You've worked all night before," the man protested. "So have you." Together, they pushed the bins towards the loading dock. "Thank you," he said. She shrugged. "We're on the same team." And that was how Susan saw the hospital: doctors, housekeepers, security guards, receptionists, nurses, cleaning crews. Everyone carried someone else's hardest day. Inside, the familiar scent of disinfectant wrapped around her. Monitors beeped rhythmically. Stretchers rolled past. Families whispered nervous prayers in waiting rooms. Someone laughed down the hall. Someone cried behind a curtain. Life and heartbreak shared the same building every hour of every day. Susan clipped on her name badge. Registered nurse, Susan Miller. Room after room, patient after patient, she moved with calm efficiency. She remembered birthdays. Adjusted pillows without being asked. Explained medications twice if necessary. Held frightened hands before procedures. She believed medicine healed bodies. Kindness helped people survive the rest. Late that evening, she finally sat for a 7-minute break. Emily dropped into the chair beside her. "You actually sat down. Mark the calendar." Emily opened a vending machine bag of pretzels. "You know what I noticed?" "What?" "You treat every patient like they're somebody's family." Susan smiled. "They are." Emily looked at her thoughtfully. "No, even the ones nobody visits." Susan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared through the staff lounge window toward the emergency entrance. Ambulances arrived every day. Some patients came surrounded by family. Some arrived with flowers. Some arrived with lawyers. Some arrived completely alone. Nobody deserved to feel invisible simply because no one came looking for them. Susan folded the empty paper cup from her coffee. "I guess everyone deserves one person who looks them in the eyes." Emily smiled quietly. "That's why you're different." Before Susan could reply, the loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Code stroke, emergency department, incoming patient, ETA 3 minutes. Every conversation stopped. Every nurse stood. Every second suddenly mattered again. Susan instinctively reached into her locker for fresh gloves before hurrying toward the emergency department, unaware that the patient arriving in the next few minutes would quietly alter the course of her own life. The automatic doors of Mercy General Hospital slid open with a sharp hiss, just as the ambulance backed into the emergency bay. Rainwater streaked across the windshield. The flashing red lights painted brief flashes across the concrete walls before disappearing into the gray Chicago afternoon. Susan pulled on a fresh pair of gloves while the paramedics rolled the stretcher inside. "Male, approximately 63, one paramedic reported while walking beside the gurney. "Possible transient ischemic attack, severe dehydration, blood pressure unstable, responsive but confused." The man lying on the stretcher looked older than 63. His gray beard had grown unevenly, as if trimmed with a dull pocket knife. Deep lines crossed his face like maps of years spent outdoors. His weathered hands were scarred thick and rough hands that had spent decades building things instead of sitting behind a desk. His clothes were worn. Not filthy, simply worn. The cuffs of his brown work jacket had been stitched several times by someone who believed nothing useful should be thrown away. His boots were cracked but polished. Susan noticed that immediately. People who had given up rarely polished old boots. She stepped beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's eyelids opened slowly. His pale blue eyes searched the room with caution rather than fear. "I hear you," he answered hoarsely. "My name is Susan. You're safe." "I've heard that before." His voice carried the weight of disappointment. As the team transferred him onto a hospital bed, a nurse reached toward the man's jacket. "I'll put your belongings into a storage bag." The man reacted instantly. "No." The word came out surprisingly firm. "It's hospital policy," another nurse explained. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers. From inside, he removed 2 objects: a worn leather notebook, a ring of old brass keys. "These stay with me." Susan gently stepped closer. "We'll keep them beside your bed. No one will take them." He studied her for several long seconds. Finally, he nodded. She carefully placed the notebook and keys into a clear plastic belongings bag, sealed it, then attached it to the bed rail where he could see it. Only then did the tension leave his shoulders. Small things mattered, sometimes more than medicine. The emergency physician completed the initial neurological exam. Fortunately, the episode appeared to be a mild stroke warning rather than a devastating one. More tests followed: blood work, brain imaging, IV fluids, medication. Hours passed. When Susan returned later that evening, the man looked slightly stronger. She carried a cup of ice chips. "How are you feeling?" "I felt worse." "That's encouraging." He smiled faintly. "You nurses always know how to make bad news sound hopeful." She laughed. "It comes with the job." He accepted one ice chip. After a long silence, he asked quietly, "Am I dying?" Susan never lied to patients. "Not today." He looked relieved. "I suppose that's enough for now." She glanced toward his chart. "There isn't much information here." He nodded. "There usually isn't. No emergency contact. No. Any family?" He looked toward the ceiling instead of answering. Susan didn't ask again. Experience had taught her that silence often revealed more than questions. Near midnight, Linda Foster from patient registration entered the room carrying a clipboard. "We still need identification and insurance information." The man's expression changed immediately. "I don't have insurance." "Any Medicare?" "No." "Medicaid?" "No." Linda remained professional. "Do you have a permanent address?" The man hesitated. "No." She continued gently. "A mailing address?" "No." "Someone we can contact again?" "No." Linda sighed almost invisibly before making another note. "We'll discuss financial assistance later." After she left, the room became painfully quiet. The man stared toward the window. "I'm sorry," he said. Susan looked up. "For what?" "For becoming paperwork." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "When people stop asking your name and start asking for numbers—" He paused. "You become paperwork." Susan sat down beside the bed. "I know your name." He looked surprised. "You do?" She smiled. "Thomas Bennett." He blinked. "I almost forgot I told someone." "You told the paramedics." "They asked." I listened. For the first time since arriving, Thomas gave a genuine smile. It transformed his tired face. "You really did." The following morning, Susan finished another long shift. She could have gone home immediately. Instead, she stopped outside Thomas's room. He was awake, staring at the leather notebook resting on his lap. "You write?" she asked. "No." "Journal?" He shook his head. "I remember." "What do you remember?" He slowly opened the notebook. Inside were names, addresses, dates, small sketches, measurements, tiny handwritten notes. Every page looked carefully organized. Susan noticed little drawings of stair railings, window frames, kitchen cabinets, porches. "You built houses." Thomas nodded. "For 38 years. A carpenter, a Finnish carpenter." His tired eyes brightened. I liked details. He pointed toward one drawing. "Most people never notice trim around a doorway." Susan leaned closer. "It's beautiful." "They shouldn't notice." She looked confused. "If they notice the trim—" He smiled. "So, I didn't do my job well enough." She laughed softly. "You sound proud." "I was. My hands aren't steady anymore." He looked down at them. Years of labor had left his fingers swollen and crooked. "I miss building things." Susan understood it. Not because she had built houses. Because she knew what it felt like when the work that defined you disappeared. "My mother baked pies," she said quietly. "When arthritis got bad," she paused. She cried more over losing her rolling pin than over the diagnosis. Thomas nodded. "It isn't about the tool." "No. It's about who you become without it." Their conversation was interrupted when another nurse entered with medication. Susan quietly excused herself. As she reached the hallway, Emily caught up beside her. "You've adopted another one." Susan smiled. "I don't adopt patients." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You remember his favorite juice already." "Apple. You remembered." "He hadn't eaten in 2 days." Emily laughed. Exactly my point. Later that afternoon, Thomas attempted to stand for physical therapy. His legs trembled violently. He nearly fell. Susan instinctively caught his arm. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You don't have to apologize. I used to carry oak beams by myself. Today, you're carrying yourself. It doesn't feel like enough." "It is today." He looked embarrassed. Susan lowered her voice. "Recovery isn't measured against your best day." He looked at her. "It's measured against yesterday." Those words stayed with him. The next morning he walked 6 steps, the day after that 11. Every evening, Susan checked on him even when he wasn't officially assigned to her floor. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. She learned that Thomas preferred black coffee but now couldn't drink caffeine because of his medication. She learned he disliked wasting food. He folded every napkin before leaving a meal tray. He thanked every housekeeper by name. He always made his own bed if he felt strong enough. One afternoon, Susan found him polishing his old boots with a tissue dampened from the sink. "You know those are 30 years old," he said. "They've lasted longer than some cars. They've lasted because someone cared for them." He rubbed another small circle into the leather. "My father used to say—" He stopped. Susan waited. "If you stop taking care of little things," he smiled sadly, "life eventually believes you've stopped caring about yourself." Susan looked at the boots. She suddenly understood why they had been clean the day he arrived. Not because Thomas had money, because dignity had become the last possession nobody could steal. Late Friday afternoon, Linda Foster approached Susan in the hallway. "We've finished reviewing Mr. Bennett's financial file." Susan noticed the serious expression immediately, and Linda lowered her voice. "His assistant's application won't cover everything." "How much?" Linda glanced around before answering. "Quite a bit." Susan felt a knot tighten inside her stomach. "When will he be discharged?" "Probably early next week." "And if he can't pay?" Linda hesitated. "He'll still leave. But he needs rehabilitation." "I know. He can barely walk across the room." "I know." Susan looked through the small window into Thomas's room. He was sitting alone, carefully writing something inside the old notebook, completely unaware that another obstacle was already waiting for him. For the first time since meeting him, Susan felt something heavier than sympathy. She felt responsibility, and she had no idea that within days she would be forced to choose between protecting the future she had spent years saving for or giving that future away to a man who had almost nothing left. Saturday arrived with a pale winter sun that barely pierced the low clouds hanging over Chicago. From the nurse's station, the city looked distant through the hospital windows, muted by cold air and sheets of thin ice covering the parking lot. Inside Mercy General, however, there was no sense of season. Monitors beeped with mechanical precision. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. Phones rang. Someone laughed down one hallway while another family quietly cried behind a curtain. Susan clipped her badge onto her scrub top and glanced automatically toward room 214. Thomas Bennett was already awake. He sat beside the window instead of lying in bed, slowly buttoning the same brown work jacket he had arrived in days earlier. The occupational therapist had encouraged him to dress himself as part of rehabilitation. His movements were painfully slow. Every button required concentration. Every successful motion looked like a small victory. Susan smiled. "Good morning." Thomas looked up. "I beat you today." "You certainly did." "I've been practicing." He held up both hands with a faint grin. "They don't shake quite as much." She walked over and examined his latest therapy chart. His balance had improved. His speech was clearer. His blood pressure had stabilized. Objectively, he was recovering. But recovery on paper and survival outside a hospital were two very different things. "How's the walking?" she asked. Thomas pointed toward the hallway. "I made it almost halfway before breakfast." "That's wonderful. I had to stop twice." "You still made it." He smiled modestly. "I suppose." The physical therapist entered a few moments later. "Ready for another lap?" Thomas nodded. Susan watched from the doorway as the older man gripped the walker and slowly stepped into the hallway. One step, pause. Another step. His breathing grew heavier after only 20 feet. Several visitors walked around him impatiently. One young man sighed dramatically because Thomas moved too slowly. Thomas immediately pulled the walker closer to the wall. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The stranger never acknowledged him. He simply kept walking. Susan felt something tighten inside her chest. People rarely intended cruelty. More often, they simply forgot that everyone else was carrying an invisible burden. When therapy ended, Thomas returned to his room exhausted. He lowered himself carefully into the chair. "I used to climb roofs," he said quietly. Susan handed him a bottle of water. "And now I celebrate reaching the end of a hallway." She leaned against the windowsill. "Do you know what I see?" "What?" "A man who refused to quit." He laughed softly. "You nurses always know how to edit reality." "No," she shook her head. "I just refuse to let your worst day define you." Thomas looked out the window. "My sister used to say something similar." Susan noticed the change in his voice. "Rebecca." He nodded. "You remember? You mentioned her once." He looked surprised. "I didn't think anyone listened that closely." "I do." Thomas smiled to himself. "She always believed people deserved another chance." "What happened to her?" He remained silent for several moments. Then he quietly answered, "Cancer." Susan didn't interrupt. "We spent 3 years fighting it." His eyes never left the window. "I sold almost everything. The house, the truck, my retirement savings, my tools. It wasn't enough." He laughed bitterly. "Funny thing about illness. It doesn't care how hard you've worked." Susan understood those words more than he realized. Hospitals taught the same lesson every day. Illness never checked bank accounts before arriving. A gentle knock interrupted them. Linda Foster stood outside holding a folder. Her professional smile looked unusually restrained. "Susan, may I speak with you?" They stepped into the hallway. Linda opened the financial file. "I finished reviewing Mr. Bennett's case." Susan immediately noticed several highlighted sections. The charity program covered some expenses. "How much?" "A little over 40%. "And the rest," Linda sighed, "still outstanding." Susan looked at the numbers. The remaining balance wasn't enormous by hospital standards, but for someone with no savings, it might as well have been impossible. "What happens now?" Susan asked. Linda spoke honestly. "We'll discharge him when the physician clears him. He still needs outpatient rehabilitation." "I know." "He needs medication." "I know." "He has nowhere to recover." "I know." Linda lowered the folder. "Susan, there are limits to what the hospital can do." Susan wasn't angry with Linda. Linda had spent years helping patients complete financial assistance forms, negotiating payment plans, searching for emergency programs. She cared deeply, but caring didn't erase mathematics. Hospitals still paid nurses, purchased medicine, maintained equipment. Compassion and budgets often collided. Susan returned to Thomas's room, carrying his afternoon medication. He noticed her expression immediately. "Bad news." She hesitated. "They're talking about discharge." "I expected that. You'll still need therapy." "I know." "Where will you go?" Thomas smiled politely. "I'll figure something out." "Do you have somewhere to stay?" His silence answered the question. A shelter. They're usually full this time of year. A friend. I've outlived most of mine. A church. I'll ask around. He spoke calmly, almost too calmly, as though disappointment had become familiar enough that he no longer argued with it. Susan looked toward the belongings bag hanging beside the bed. The old notebook, the brass keys, nothing else. Everything this man owned fit inside one plastic hospital bag. That evening, after finishing her shift, Susan drove directly to the mechanic instead of going home. Frank's auto repair occupied an aging brick garage beneath its elevated train tracks. Frank himself emerged, wiping grease from his hands. "Evening, Susan." "Hi. I've got bad news." "I figured." He lifted the Corolla onto the hydraulic lift. Together, they stood underneath. Frank pointed upward with a flashlight. "See this?" She nodded. Transmission leak, another beam of light, front suspension, then another. Brake lines. Susan quietly listened. Finally, she asked, "If I fix the important parts?" Frank interrupted gently. "They're all important." She smiled sadly. "Give me the number." Frank scribbled several figures onto a repair estimate. Susan stared at the total. $2,300. Almost exactly what she had hidden inside the blue envelope. Frank watched her face. "You've saved it. Almost. You've worked hard. I know. If you wait much longer..." He hesitated. "The car may not be worth fixing." She folded the estimate carefully. "I understand." Driving home, every new sound from the Corolla felt louder. Metal clinked softly beneath the floor. The steering wheel vibrated at stoplights. She tightened both hands around it. Just make it home. Please, the car did, barely. Inside her apartment, she removed the blue envelope from the cabinet. Again, she counted the money. $2,384. Enough to repair the car. Enough, though, to keep getting to work. Enough to avoid depending on unreliable buses through another Chicago winter. She laid the mechanic's estimate beside the envelope. For several minutes, she simply stared at both. Two piles of paper. Each represented a future. One protected hers. The other... She thought of Thomas trying to button his jacket with shaking hands. She remembered him apologizing for walking too slowly. She remembered the polished boots, the notebook, the quiet dignity. Her phone buzzed. Emily. "Hey," Susan answered. "You still at the garage?" "I just got home." "How bad?" Susan looked at the estimate. "Pretty bad," Emily sighed. "You'll fix it." "I have to." "You've saved long enough." "I know." There was a pause. Then Emily asked casually, "How's your favorite patient?" Susan smiled despite herself. "Walking better." "That's good." "They're sending him home soon." "Oh." Another pause. "Does he have family?" "No." Emily's voice softened. "Sometimes I hate this job." Susan understood exactly what she meant. Not the medicine, not the hours. The feeling of watching people recover just enough to be discharged back into the same hardships that had nearly destroyed them in the first place. After hanging up, Susan carried the blue envelope into the living room. She placed it on the coffee table. Beside it, she laid the repair estimate. Then she wrote another number on a blank sheet of paper. Thomas Bennett's remaining hospital balance. She had copied it from memory after speaking with Linda. The two numbers were almost identical. Susan sat motionless. Outside, snowflakes began drifting quietly beneath the streetlights. Inside, only the ticking wall clock broke the silence. She looked from one piece of paper to the other again. Then she whispered the question no one else could answer. What if only one of us gets a second chance? Susan barely slept that night. The blue envelope remained on the coffee table long after midnight, untouched except for the countless times she picked it up, opened it, counted the bills, and placed everything back exactly as it had been before. It wasn't indecision born from greed. It was fear. Fear of being stranded in the middle of a Chicago winter. Fear of losing the only reliable way to reach Mercy General before dawn. Fear of missing shifts she could not afford to miss. Fear of becoming the very person who needed help. Just before sunrise, she stood by the apartment window with another cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Across the street, an elderly man struggled to shovel snow from the sidewalk in front of a small grocery store. A teenage boy walking past stopped without being asked. He took the shovel. 5 quiet minutes later, they finished together. Neither of them knew the other. Neither expected anything in return. The old man simply smiled. The teenager waved and continued toward the bus stop. Susan watched until both disappeared. Sometimes kindness wasn't complicated. People complicated it by calculating the cost before remembering the value. At 7:30, she picked up the blue envelope, slipped it into her shoulder bag, grabbed her coat, and walked downstairs. The Corolla started after 3 attempts. The engine coughed loudly. A cloud of gray smoke drifted behind the car. "One more trip," Susan whispered gently, patting the steering wheel. The hospital parking lot was already crowded. Inside, the emergency department buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. A child cried while receiving stitches. An exhausted police officer leaned against the wall drinking coffee. 2 surgeons hurried past without noticing anyone around them. Susan changed into fresh scrubs and headed directly toward room 214. Thomas looked stronger. He was reading the old leather notebook. When he noticed her, he smiled. "I made it all the way to physical therapy without stopping." "You did?" Even surprised myself. "I'm proud of you." He looked embarrassed by the compliment. "You know," he said quietly. "I don't hear those words very often." Susan smiled. "You earned them." He nodded slowly. "I'll keep trying." As she adjusted his IV line, Thomas asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do nurses ever get tired of caring?" Susan thought for a moment. "We get tired, but not of caring." He looked relieved. "I was worried I was becoming a burden." She gently shook her head. "A burden isn't someone who needs help." "What is?" "Someone who stops seeing other people as human." Thomas lowered his eyes. "I've met a few of those." "So have I. But I've met many more who weren't." He smiled faintly. "So have I." Later that morning, Linda Foster called Susan into the financial services office. The room was modest. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. A coffee maker hummed quietly in the corner. Stacks of folders covered Linda's desk. She looked exhausted. "You wanted to see me." Linda closed the office door. "I need to finalize Mr. Bennett's discharge paperwork." Susan nodded. "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon, if everything goes well." She hesitated. "He's still short." "I know." Linda rubbed her forehead. "I've searched every assistance program available. No emergency foundation. Denied religious charities. They're overwhelmed. County support. Waiting list." Susan quietly looked down at the folder. The remaining balance stared back from the final page, almost identical to the amount inside her blue envelope. Linda noticed where Susan's eyes had stopped. "I wish I had another answer." Susan asked quietly. "If someone wanted to pay anonymously," Linda looked up. "It happens occasionally. They could, yes. Would the patient know? Only if the donor wanted them to." Susan didn't say anything else. Linda continued organizing paperwork, unaware that a decision had already begun forming inside Susan's mind. The afternoon passed in a blur of medications, chart updates, and patient rounds. Yet, no matter what task she performed, the same two numbers followed her: 2,384, 2,312. Her savings, his balance. By 5 o'clock, she found herself standing outside the hospital chapel. She wasn't particularly religious. She visited only when life became too heavy to carry alone. Inside, only 3 candles burned. A woman whispered prayers in Spanish. An elderly couple sat holding hands in complete silence. Susan slipped into the last pew. She didn't ask for a miracle. She asked for clarity. After several minutes, she remembered something her mother had once told her. When you already know the right thing, don't pray for an easier answer. Susan closed her eyes. Her mother had been gone 8 years, yet somehow those words still sounded fresh. She stood. The decision no longer felt confusing, only difficult. Just before 6, she knocked on Linda Foster's office again. Linda looked surprised. "Everything okay?" Susan entered, carrying the blue envelope. "I'd like to make a payment." Linda smiled politely. "For your own account?" Susan placed the envelope on the desk. "No." Linda opened it. Her smile slowly disappeared. She looked back up. "Susan, I'd like to pay Mr. Bennett's remaining balance." Linda stared at her. "You don't have to do this." "I know. Does he know? He must never know." Linda remained silent. "This is your savings, isn't it?" Susan nodded. "I've been putting it aside for almost 3 years. For your car." Another nod. Linda looked genuinely heartbroken. "Susan, if he asks, I'll simply tell him the balance has been settled. Please, don't tell him my name." "Why?" Susan smiled softly. "Because gratitude can become another kind of debt." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I've worked here 22 years. She paused. "I've never seen someone give away everything they saved." Susan laughed quietly. "It isn't everything." Linda looked confused. "I still have my job." The older woman reached across the desk and gently squeezed Susan's hand. "I'll honor your request." Together, they counted every bill. 20 after 20, 10 after 10, 5 after 5. When the final dollar was entered into the system, Linda printed a receipt. She placed it inside the now empty blue envelope. "What would you like me to do with this?" Susan thought for a moment. "Keep the receipt." She removed a small folded note from her pocket. "I brought something." She unfolded the paper. Only one sentence appeared in neat handwriting. "You don't owe me. Just don't waste your second chance." Linda read it twice. "Beautiful. I'd like him to receive this, without your name, without anything." Linda slipped both the receipt and the handwritten note into the blue envelope. Then she sealed it carefully. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. The envelope suddenly seemed much heavier than paper should feel. Susan thanked Linda and quietly left the office. As she walked toward the parking lot, snow had begun falling again. She reached the Corolla, turned the key. Nothing. She tried again. The starter clicked weakly. A third attempt, the engine finally caught. She laughed despite herself. "I know," she whispered to the dashboard. "I promised I'd fix you." Driving home, every unfamiliar vibration sounded louder than before. Yet, strangely, she felt lighter, not because her problems had disappeared. They hadn't. Her car still needed repairs. Her savings account was empty. She would almost certainly spend weeks riding buses before she could afford even the most basic maintenance. Nothing about her own circumstances had improved. But somewhere upstairs in room 214, one man would leave the hospital with a chance to keep recovering, instead of carrying another impossible burden. That night, after Susan went home, Linda walked quietly into Thomas Bennett's room. I have something for you." Thomas looked up. "What is it?" Linda handed him the sealed blue envelope. He opened it slowly. First, he saw the receipt showing a zero balance. His brow furrowed in confusion. Then he unfolded the handwritten note. He read the sentence once, then again. His weathered hands began to tremble. Tears gathered silently before he even realized he was crying. He looked up at Linda, who did this. She smiled gently. Someone who asked to remain anonymous. Thomas pressed the small note carefully against his chest. For several long moments he couldn't speak. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Then, whoever they are." He stopped as emotion overtook him. "I hope someday they learn they didn't just pay a bill." Linda quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Neither she nor Thomas could have imagined that the little blue envelope resting in his trembling hands had already begun changing far more lives than either of them yet understood. Monday morning arrived with temperatures well below freezing. The sidewalks outside Susan Miller's apartment had turned into narrow ribbons of packed snow and black ice. Cars crawled through intersections, their tires crunching over salt spread before dawn. Susan stood beside her Corolla, holding the same travel mug she carried every workday. She turned the key. The engine sputtered, shook violently, then died. She tried again. Nothing. A third attempt produced only a hollow, clicking sound. Susan rested both hands on the steering wheel and closed her eyes. So, this is it. She wasn't angry, only tired. After another minute, she climbed out, locked the car, and looked toward the nearest bus stop nearly 6 blocks away. The wind cut through her coat immediately. She pulled her scarf tighter and began walking. The sidewalks were uneven beneath fresh snow. Twice she nearly slipped. By the time she reached the bus shelter, her cheeks had gone numb. The electronic display flashed another delay. 8 minutes. 8 became 14. 14 became 19. Several commuters sighed in frustration. A construction worker stamped his boots to stay warm. A young mother wrapped another blanket around her sleeping toddler inside a stroller. Nobody complained aloud. Chicago winters taught patience whether people wanted the lesson or not. When the bus finally arrived, every seat was already occupied. Susan stood near the back holding the overhead rail while the vehicle lurched through traffic. Her commute, once 20 minutes by car, stretched to nearly 70. She reached Mercy General 7 minutes before her shift. Just enough time to change into scrubs. Just enough time to breathe. Emily Ross noticed immediately. "You took the bus." Susan nodded. "The car." Susan smiled weakly. It finally surrendered. Emily frowned. "I knew it. I'll figure something out." "You always do." Susan shrugged. "It's either that or walk." Emily studied her friend's face. "You look exhausted." "I'll survive." Emily hesitated. "You know you could have told me." "Told you what?" "That things were this bad." Susan simply smiled again. Some kindness was easier to give than receive. The morning passed quickly. Patients came and went. Admissions, discharges, family meetings, medication rounds. Life continued without asking whether anyone felt prepared. Near noon, Susan quietly checked room 214. Thomas Bennett was gone. His bed had already been stripped. Fresh linens waited for the next patient. For several seconds she simply stood there. Hospitals rarely paused. People arrived, people healed, people left. Sometimes they returned. Sometimes they never did. A housekeeper entered carrying clean blankets. "You looking for the gentleman who was here?" Susan nodded. "He left early this morning." "How was he?" "He smiled the whole way out." Susan felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. She hoped that smile lasted longer than the ride home. She hoped he found somewhere safe. She hoped. She stopped herself. Hope alone couldn't protect someone sleeping outdoors. During lunch break, Linda Foster appeared beside the nurse's station carrying a folder. She waited until no one else stood nearby. "I wanted you to know," Susan immediately understood who she meant. "He was discharged," Linda nodded. "He asked about the envelope again." Susan remained silent. "He cried." Susan looked away. "I've never seen someone hold a handwritten note the way he held yours. I didn't write it for recognition." "I know." Linda smiled gently. "He folded it into his wallet." Susan blinked. "He didn't leave it behind." "No." "He said it was worth more than anything else he owned." Linda paused. "He also asked me one favor." Susan looked up. "What?" "If whoever helped him ever came back," Linda smiled softly, "he wanted me to tell them he intended to earn the gift." Susan swallowed quietly. No more words were needed. That afternoon, another unexpected challenge appeared. The bus Susan relied on for the return trip broke down halfway through its route. Passengers climbed off into freezing wind to wait for another bus. Susan glanced at the time. It was nearly 10 o'clock. She wouldn't reach home until almost midnight. A younger nurse complained loudly, "This city is impossible." An elderly passenger standing beside Susan smiled. "I've lived here 50 years. And the city's never been easy." He looked toward the dark street. "But people sometimes are." 5 minutes later, a stranger in a pickup truck stopped. He rolled down his window. Bus broke down. Several passengers nodded cautiously. "I'm heading toward Logan Square." 3 people accepted the ride. Others waited. Susan stayed. Not because she distrusted him, because there wasn't enough room. She watched the truck disappear. The elderly man beside her chuckled. "See?" Susan smiled. "People sometimes are." When she finally reached home, she found an envelope tucked beneath her apartment door. For one brief second, her heart skipped. Blue no, only a utility bill. She laughed quietly at herself. Inside, she heated canned soup for dinner. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Without thinking, she opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. The familiar hiding place stood empty. For years, the blue envelope had rested there. Now, only a faint rectangular outline remained in the dust. She closed the cabinet gently. The emptiness startled her more than she expected. Not because of the money, because saving had become a ritual. Every overtime shift, every skipped restaurant meal, every repaired pair of shoes instead of buying new ones, every sacrifice had ended inside that envelope. Now the ritual was over. The purpose had changed. Tuesday afternoon, during another busy shift, Susan noticed Emily studying her. "What?" Emily folded her arms. "You've been different." "In what way?" "Calmer." Susan laughed. "My car died. I'm taking 2 buses. I've barely slept. And somehow you look—" Emily searched for the word. "Lighter." Susan thought about that. Maybe she was. Not happier, not less tired. Simply lighter. There was a strange freedom in letting go of something she'd clung to for years. That evening, Mercy General admitted another homeless patient. An older woman suffering from pneumonia. Several staff members spoke only about insurance, about paperwork, about bed availability. Susan pulled up a chair. "What would you like me to call you?" The woman looked surprised. "No one's asked that." "Oh, what should I call you?" "Martha. It's nice to meet you, Martha." Emily watched from across the hallway. Later she whispered, "You always start with their name." Susan smiled. Everybody deserves to hear it. Far across the city, Thomas Bennett sat inside a small church shelter. A volunteer handed him a bowl of hot stew. He quietly thanked her. Before eating, he removed the folded note from his wallet. The edges had already softened from being opened again and again. "You don't owe me. Just don't waste your second chance." He read the sentence silently, then carefully folded it once more. A younger man sitting nearby noticed. "You read that every day." Thomas nodded. "What's it say?" Thomas smiled. "A stranger reminded me I'm still responsible for the life I have left." The younger man looked confused. "They gave you money." "No. They gave me something harder." "What?" "A reason." The shelter volunteer approached. "Mr. Bennett." "Yes?" "You've got a phone message." Thomas looked puzzled. "For me? A lawyer's office." Thomas frowned. "I don't know any lawyers." "They asked if you're staying here." Thomas slowly stood. His pulse quickened. No one had searched for him in years. Who would hire a lawyer to find a man who owned nothing? Across town, Michael Carter sat alone in his office reviewing another thick file. Stamped across the front was one name, Thomas Bennett. A yellow note attached to the cover read, "Urgent. Final beneficiary confirmation required." Michael removed his glasses and stared out the window. "We finally found him," he murmured to himself. He had no idea that before he could complete the final legal steps left behind by Rebecca Bennett, he would first become obsessed with another mystery. Who was the anonymous person whose quiet act of generosity had kept Thomas alive long enough for any of this to matter? That single unanswered question would soon lead him to a tiny apartment, an empty blue envelope, and the woman who never expected anyone to come looking for her. On Wednesday morning, Thomas Bennett stood outside the small brick church shelter on the south side of Chicago, with his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his worn brown jacket. Snow had stopped overnight, leaving the streets covered in a thin layer of white that reflected the pale winter sunlight. A city bus rumbled past. Office workers hurried towards downtown. Delivery trucks backed into loading docks. Life moved with its usual urgency. Thomas remained still. The volunteer at the shelter had written a phone number on the back of a paper napkin. Michael Carter, attorney at law. Please call as soon as possible. Thomas had stared at those words half the night. He could think of no reason why a lawyer would be searching for him. He had no unpaid inheritance, no property, no family left except memories. The only person who had ever needed lawyers was his older sister, Rebecca. He folded the napkin carefully and slipped it inside the leather notebook. The same notebook had once held cabinet measurements, stair designs, and customer addresses. Now it protected memories instead. A volunteer approached, carrying a steaming paper cup. "Coffee." Thomas smiled. "You always remember. You always say thank you." She handed him the cup. "You going to make the call?" "I suppose I should. You look nervous." "I spent 30 years fixing people's homes." He looked toward the city skyline. "I've learned that unexpected visitors rarely bring simple news." The volunteer laughed softly. "I'll pray this one does." Thomas walked 3 blocks to a public library. The building had become one of the few places where he still felt welcome. It was warm, quiet. No one questioned why he stayed for hours. The librarian behind the front desk recognized him immediately. "Morning, Mr. Bennett." "Morning, Diane." "You using the phone today? If that's all right." "You know you never have to ask." She handed him the cordless phone reserved for patrons. Thomas stared at the number for nearly a full minute before dialing. The call connected after 2 rings. Law offices of Carter and Wallace. Thomas cleared his throat. "My name is Thomas Bennett." The receptionist paused. "Please don't hang up." Within seconds, another voice came onto the line. Older, calm, professional. "Mr. Bennett?" "Yes." "This is Michael Carter." I was told you were looking for me. We've been looking for you for almost 5 months. Thomas frowned. There must be some mistake. There isn't. Michael's voice softened. Mr. Bennett, this call is about your sister. Everything inside Thomas became still. Rebecca? He hadn't heard anyone speak her name aloud in almost 2 years. When can we meet? Michael asked. Thomas looked around the library. I don't exactly have an office. I'll come to you. You would? Absolutely. They agreed to meet that afternoon inside the library's small reading room. At exactly 2 o'clock, Michael Carter walked through the entrance carrying a weathered leather briefcase. He appeared to be in his early 50s. His charcoal overcoat looked expensive, but worn enough to suggest years of daily use rather than display. When he spotted Thomas, he smiled warmly instead of formally. Mr. Bennett, Thomas stood. You found me. I've been hoping to say those words. They shook hands. Michael noticed immediately how rough Thomas's palms still were, carpenter's hands, even after years away from the trade. They sat across from one another at a wooden table. Michael carefully opened his briefcase. Instead of legal documents, he first removed an old photograph. A woman stood between the two of them in the picture. She wore a navy blue suit. Her smile looked remarkably similar to Thomas's. Rebecca Bennett. Thomas picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. I haven't seen this one. It was taken after she received an award from the Illinois Bar Association. Thomas smiled through gathering tears. She hated photographs. Michael laughed. She tolerated them. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Michael folded his hands. I represented your sister for nearly 18 years. Thomas nodded quietly. She trusted you. I hope so. Michael hesitated. She also trusted you. Thomas looked confused. Me. More than anyone. He reached into the briefcase again. This time he removed a thick folder marked Bennett Community Health Trust. Thomas stared at the title. I've never seen that. You weren't supposed to, Michael slowly explained. During Rebecca's final year of life, while chemotherapy gradually weakened her body, she became increasingly concerned about something she had witnessed throughout her legal career: families bankrupted by medical debt, patients skipping treatment because they couldn't afford medication, parents choosing between rent and chemotherapy, veterans quietly disappearing after hospital discharge because no one could pay for rehabilitation. Rebecca had spent years handling wills and charitable trusts. She decided to create one herself. Not enormous, not designed to build buildings bearing her name. Instead, she wanted a practical fund that could quietly cover emergency medical expenses for ordinary people whose lives might be changed by a relatively small amount of money. She called it, Michael smiled, the Second Chance Fund. Thomas lowered his eyes. That sounds exactly like her. Michael nodded. It does. But why me? Because she named you as the final approving beneficiary. Thomas frowned. I don't understand. Michael opened another document. Rebecca believed lawyers should never completely control compassion. He pointed toward a paragraph. She wrote that the person making final decisions should be someone who understood sacrifice better than financial statements. Thomas read silently, then stopped. His own name appeared several times. She wanted me. Michael nodded. You were to review recommendations made by the board. I don't know anything about running a charity. She knew that. Then why? Michael smiled gently. She trusted your heart. Thomas closed in the folder slowly. I couldn't even save her. Michael leaned forward. You stayed beside her every chemotherapy session. You sold your home. You emptied your retirement. You became her caregiver. You did more than most people ever would. Thomas looked away. It wasn't enough. No, Michael answered quietly. It wasn't enough to stop cancer, but it was enough for her to spend her last years surrounded by someone who never left. Silence settled between them. Outside the reading room, children laughed near the library entrance. Life continued as though this conversation were ordinary. It wasn't. "There is one problem," Michael finally said. Thomas looked up. "The trust could not be activated after Rebecca died." "Why?" "You disappeared." Thomas nodded sadly. "I lost the house." "I know." "I stopped answering letters." "I know. I couldn't bear reading them." Michael understood. Without Thomas's legal acknowledgement, several final documents remained incomplete. By law, the trust could not distribute funds indefinitely without satisfying Rebecca's explicit instructions. Deadlines had been extended repeatedly. Now, only weeks remained. "If we fail to complete everything," Michael paused, "the remaining assets will be transferred elsewhere according to state requirements." Thomas's shoulders slumped. "Rebecca's dream dies," Michael answered honestly. "Yes." Thomas closed his eyes. "I almost died last week." Michael looked surprised. "I suffered a mild stroke. I didn't know. They told me another few days." He stopped. Might have been enough. Michael sat very still. For the first time, the timing of everything truly settled over him. Rebecca's trust, Thomas's illness, the approaching legal deadline, the narrow margin by which everything had nearly been lost. "What kept you alive?" Michael asked quietly. Thomas reached into his wallet. He unfolded the now well-worn note. Michael read the sentence. "You don't owe me. Just don't waste your second chance." "Someone paid my hospital bill?" Thomas smiled faintly. "I never learned who." Michael examined the handwriting. "No signature." "They wanted none." "Did the hospital tell you anything?" Thomas shook his head. "Only that kindness still exists." Michael folded the paper carefully before handing it back. "This person," he paused, "saved more than your recovery." Thomas looked puzzled. Michael glanced toward the thick trust documents lying across the table. "They may have saved Rebecca's life's work." Neither man spoke for several moments. Michael suddenly realized that before he could honor Rebecca Bennett's final wishes, he first needed to solve another mystery. Someone had quietly sacrificed years of personal savings for a stranger. Not for recognition. Not for reward. Not even for gratitude. That kind of person was exceedingly rare, and for reasons Michael could not yet fully explain, he felt certain Rebecca herself would have insisted on meeting them. As he packed the documents back into his briefcase, one thought refused to leave his mind. Whoever had written that single sentence inside the blue envelope had unknowingly become part of Rebecca Bennett's unfinished legacy. Now he intended to find them. For the first time in months, Michael Carter left his office feeling something other than frustration. The icy wind sweeping across downtown Chicago barely registered as he stepped onto the sidewalk with Rebecca Bennett's trust documents tucked securely beneath his arm. Until that afternoon, every page inside the thick folder had represented unfinished legal work. Now they represented possibility. Thomas Bennett was alive. Weak, certainly. Still rebuilding his health. Still carrying more questions than answers. But alive. That single fact meant Rebecca's final wishes still had a chance to become reality. Yet another thought refused to leave Michael's mind. Someone had quietly changed the course of all of it. A stranger, an anonymous hospital donor. Someone who had looked at a man with no insurance, no address, and no family listed in his records, and decided his life still mattered. Michael had practiced law for nearly 28 years. He believed in contracts, evidence, deadlines, signatures. But he also knew that every important case eventually turned on one unpredictable element: a human decision. And somewhere inside Mercy General Hospital, someone had made one. The following morning, Thomas arrived at Michael's office, carrying the old leather notebook beneath one arm. He looked healthier than he had inside the hospital, though every movement remained careful. Michael noticed that Thomas paused before sitting, almost as though his body still negotiated every motion. "You shouldn't have taken the bus," Michael said. Thomas smiled. "It reminded me I'm still capable." Michael poured 2 cups of coffee. Black. Exactly as Thomas preferred. They spent the first hour reviewing trust documents. Rebecca had left detailed instructions. The Second Chance Fund would not pay for extravagant medical procedures. It would focus on moments when relatively modest assistance could completely alter a patient's future. Hospital deductibles, emergency prescriptions, short-term rehabilitation, medical transportation, temporary lodging during treatment, small interventions, large consequences. She believed people usually don't need miracles, Michael said. They need breathing room. Thomas smiled. That sounds exactly like Rebecca. Michael nodded. She wrote most of the mission statement herself. Thomas slowly turned another page. I wish she'd lived long enough to see this. So do I. Another silence settled between them. Finally, Thomas looked up. The person who helped me. Michael immediately understood. I've been thinking about that. Thomas removed the folded note from his wallet. The edges had become noticeably softer after days of being unfolded and read repeatedly. I don't want to repay them. Michael looked surprised. You don't? Thomas shook his head. They didn't ask for repayment. What do you want? I want them to know. He struggled to find the words. That I listened. Michael smiled gently. You intend to honor the message. Thomas nodded. They asked me not to waste my second chance. He looked toward Rebecca's folder. I won't. Michael leaned back thoughtfully. Then a possibility occurred to him. Did the hospital tell you anything? Thomas smiled faintly. Only that someone wished to remain anonymous. No name, no description. Thomas shook his head again. Only the envelope. The envelope? It was light blue. Michael frowned. And the note. That's all. He carefully examined the handwriting again. Neat, consistent. No unnecessary flourishes. Someone accustomed to writing medical notes, perhaps, or school papers. Nothing obvious. He placed the paper carefully on his desk. I think we should try to find them. Thomas looked uncertain. Wouldn't that violate what they wanted? Michael considered the question. If they truly wish to remain anonymous forever. He paused. We'll respect that. Then why search? Because Rebecca believed gratitude should never disappear without trying. Thomas lowered his eyes. I'd at least like the opportunity to thank them. Later that afternoon, Michael drove to Mercy General Hospital. The lobby looked exactly as the hospitals always did. Families waiting, doctors hurrying, volunteers offering directions, coffee cups balanced on windowsills, hope and fear occupying the same space. He introduced himself at the reception desk. Within 20 minutes, he was seated inside Linda Foster's office. Linda adjusted her reading glasses while reviewing his business card. You're Mr. Bennett's attorney. I am. I'm glad he seems to be recovering. So am I. Michael explained Rebecca's trust and the unusual circumstances surrounding Thomas's disappearance. Linda listened quietly. When he finished, she smiled. Your client was fortunate. He knows that. He speaks about it constantly. Michael hesitated. I have one difficult question. Linda already knew what was coming. The anonymous payment. Michael nodded. I understand privacy laws. I won't ask for confidential financial information unless appropriate. Linda folded her hands. I'm afraid I cannot reveal donor identities. I expected that. She looked relieved. Michael continued. But perhaps you could pass along a message. Linda considered it carefully. If I knew who it was. Michael watched her face. Something changed almost imperceptibly. Not recognition. Memory. A memory she chose not to speak aloud. Instead, she answered carefully. If the opportunity ever presents itself, she paused. I'll pass along your appreciation. Michael nodded respectfully. I'd appreciate that. As he prepared to leave, another question surfaced. The note. Linda looked up. What about it? Have you ever seen those words before? She smiled very softly. No, but I don't think I'll ever forget them. Michael noticed the sincerity in her voice. That note had affected more than Thomas. After leaving the office, he paused near the emergency department. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. Wheelchairs rolled past. One woman in blue scrubs knelt beside an elderly patient to help him tie his shoes. Another stayed with the frightened child, while his mother completed paperwork. Michael watched quietly. Medicine saved lives every day. Compassion often happened where no one applauded. His phone rang. Thomas. Everything all right? Michael asked. I was just thinking. About the person. Michael smiled. So was I. I remembered something. What? They folded the note. Michael frowned. Folded. 3 times. Michael laughed softly. I don't think that'll narrow our search. No, Thomas smiled through the phone. But it tells me they wanted it to fit inside a wallet. Michael stopped walking. That small observation lingered. Not because it identified anyone, because it revealed intention. Whoever had written that message expected Thomas to carry it, to keep it, to return to it. The note hadn't been written for one emotional moment. It had been written for every difficult day afterward. Back at the office, Michael reopened Rebecca's trust documents. Attached to the final page was a handwritten letter Rebecca had written months before her death. He had read it dozens of times. Yet one sentence suddenly struck him differently. Choose people who understand sacrifice before choosing people who understand money. Michael slowly lowered the page. Rebecca had been describing future trustees. But somehow those words reminded him of the unknown donor. Someone who gave without expecting visibility. Someone willing to sacrifice years of savings for a complete stranger. That was exactly the kind of person Rebecca would have trusted. Late that evening, Michael called every administrator connected to the trust. I've located Thomas. Celebration filled the conference call. Then Michael added one more sentence. I also believe we need to find the anonymous donor. One board member sounded puzzled. Why? Michael answered without hesitation. Because this trust exists because one ordinary person quietly chose compassion over convenience. Another voice replied, but they may not want recognition. I'm not offering recognition. What then? Michael looked again at Rebecca's handwritten mission statement. An invitation. He ended the call and stared out at the city lights stretching across Chicago. Thousands of windows glowed against the winter darkness. Behind each one lived someone carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. Some were waiting for help. Some had given it. Some had unknowingly changed lives without ever discovering the consequences. Somewhere among those countless lights was the person who had emptied a blue envelope and quietly altered the future of Rebecca Bennett's dream. Michael didn't know their name. He didn't know their age. He didn't know whether they were a doctor, a nurse, a receptionist, or someone completely unrelated to the hospital. But he made one silent promise before turning off the office lights. He would find them, not to reward them, not to place them on a stage, but because certain acts of kindness deserved the chance to become something even greater than the moment that created them. Without realizing it, Michael had already taken the first step toward the small apartment where a woman named Susan Miller still believed no one would ever know what she had done. The search began with almost nothing. No name, no receipt linked to a public donation, no handwritten signature, only a blue envelope, a single sentence, and one anonymous act of compassion that had quietly altered the future of the Bennett Community Health Trust. Michael Carter had handled missing heirs, disputed estates, and decades-old property cases. He had learned that people often believed answers arrived through dramatic breakthroughs. In reality, they usually appeared through tiny details everyone else overlooked. On Thursday morning, he returned to Mercy General carrying only a legal pad and Rebecca Bennett's trust authorization papers. Linda Foster welcomed him with a tired smile. "I had a feeling you'd be back. I'm afraid you know me too well already." She laughed. Lawyers rarely stop after one question. Michael nodded. Guilty. They sat in her office again, this time without the formal introductions. "I won't ask you to violate hospital policy," Michael began. "I appreciate that. But perhaps you can help me understand your procedures." Linda leaned back. "What would you like to know?" When someone anonymously pays another patient's balance, they complete paperwork. Cash, sometimes. Credit cards, sometimes. Checks, occasionally. And identities. We document them. Michael expected that answer. "And those records remain confidential." "Exactly." He closed his notebook. "I understand." Linda hesitated. "There is one thing I can tell you." Michael looked up. The person who helped Mr. Bennett never asked whether he deserved it. She smiled thoughtfully. They only asked whether the payment would allow him to continue treatment. Michael wrote nothing. Some observations deserved memory rather than ink. "That tells me something about who they are." Linda nodded. "It told me the same thing." As he stood to leave, Linda called after him. "Mr. Carter?" He turned. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to be noticed." She glanced toward the hallway outside. The person you're looking for tried very hard not to be. I know. If you find them..." She paused. "Please be gentle." "I will." Outside the office, Michael wandered slowly through the hospital corridors. He wasn't searching randomly. He was watching. How people spoke, how they listened, how they treated patients who had no visitors. Rebecca had often said character revealed itself in ordinary moments, not extraordinary speeches. Near the oncology waiting room, he watched a nurse kneel beside an elderly woman struggling to zip her winter coat. The nurse smiled warmly, finished helping, then hurried away without expecting thanks. Near pediatrics, another employee quietly bought juice from a vending machine for a father who had forgotten his wallet. Small kindnesses happened everywhere. None of them announced themselves. Michael wondered how many remarkable people moved through hospitals unnoticed every day. Meanwhile, Susan Miller was living the busiest week she could remember. Without her car, every morning began nearly an hour earlier. She woke at 3:45, caught the first bus before dawn, transferred downtown, walked the final 12 minutes to Mercy General through freezing wind. By the time she reached the nurse's locker, room, her fingers often remained numb despite thick gloves. She never complained, not because the commute wasn't difficult, because complaining wouldn't shorten it. Emily noticed anyway. "You've lost weight." Susan looked surprised. "Have I?" You're skipping lunch again. I'm just busy. Emily folded her arms. You've said that every day this week. Susan smiled. I'll eat later. You always say later. Emily reached into her own lunch bag and placed half a turkey sandwich onto Susan's tray. No. Yes. I brought food. Emily looked inside Susan's lunch container. Rice, frozen vegetables. Nothing else. She quietly pushed the sandwich closer. My mother used to say sharing calories never made anyone poorer. Susan laughed. I've never heard that one. She made it up. Susan accepted half the sandwich. Thank you. Emily shrugged. Next week you buy dessert. Deal. The moment passed so naturally that neither woman realized another pair of eyes had quietly witnessed it. Linda Foster stood near the finance office doorway carrying a stack of folders. She watched Susan thank Emily with genuine warmth. The same modest gratitude Linda had seen when Susan had emptied the blue envelope. She remembered that afternoon perfectly. Susan had apologized for taking up her time, apologized. While giving away nearly every dollar she had spent years saving, Linda had worked in hospital finance for more than 2 decades. She had seen wealthy donors request photographs. Business leaders ask for press releases. Families insist on memorial plaques. Susan had requested only silence. Linda returned to her office, thinking about Michael's words. If you find them, please be gentle. She hoped he understood exactly what that meant. Late that afternoon, Thomas arrived for his first outpatient rehabilitation appointment. Walking remained difficult. His left leg still dragged slightly after longer distances, but he refused a wheelchair. I'll get there. The therapist smiled. No rush. While waiting, Thomas noticed another patient becoming frustrated with the exercises. A younger man threw a resistance band onto the floor. This is pointless. Thomas slowly bent, picked it up, and handed it back. I used to build staircases. The younger man looked confused. So, the first step was never the staircase. The man frowned. I don't get it. Thomas smiled. You don't build the whole thing today. He gently placed the band into the man's hand. You build the next step. The younger patient stared at him, then quietly resumed exercising. Across the room, the physical therapist smiled to herself. Someone had already begun using their second chance exactly as promised. That evening, Michael received another call from Thomas. I remembered something else. Michael laughed. I was hoping you would. The envelope. What about it? It wasn't new. Michael paused. You noticed that. There was a tiny crease near one corner. So, it had been folded before. Michael smiled. A reused envelope. I think so. They both fell silent. Such a tiny detail. Yet it somehow fit the picture forming in Michael's mind. Not someone with unlimited resources. Someone careful. Someone who reused envelopes instead of buying new ones. Someone who counted expenses. Someone who sacrificed. After ending the call, Michael drove home instead of returning to the office. The city lights reflected across the Chicago River as traffic crawled through downtown. He found himself thinking less like a lawyer and more like Rebecca. What would she notice? Not wealth, not status, not the credentials. She would notice patterns. She would ask who consistently chose other people over convenience. The following morning, Michael visited Mercy General one final time that week. As he crossed the main lobby, he overheard 2 employees talking near the coffee kiosk. She's been taking the bus all week. I heard her car finally died. Still never complains. Michael slowed his pace almost instinctively. Who? The nurse on 4. Susan. I don't know how she does it. Michael continued walking without interrupting. Susan. It was only a first name, nothing more. Hospitals employed dozens of nurses, yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he wrote it down. Not because he believed he had found the answer, because every investigation began with one small clue. Upstairs, Linda Foster was reviewing payment records from the previous month when one file slipped from a stack and landed on the floor. Several papers scattered. She knelt to gather them. One receipt slid beneath her desk. She reached down and pulled it free. The donor copy, anonymous payment. Patient Thomas Bennett. She stared at the familiar handwriting authorizing the transaction. Not the signature. The handwriting on the attached note. You don't owe me. Just don't waste your second chance. Linda slowly folded the paper again. Then she looked toward the hallway where Susan had just walked past on her way to another patient. A difficult realization settled over her. Michael Carter wasn't the only person searching anymore. She had begun wondering whether keeping Susan's identity hidden truly honored Susan's wishes, or whether allowing Rebecca Bennett's dream to continue without the woman who had unknowingly protected it would become a different kind of injustice. She wasn't ready to decide, but she knew one thing with certainty. The moment of that decision was drawing closer. By the second week without her car, Susan Miller had stopped checking the weather forecast. It didn't matter anymore. Whether Chicago greeted her with freezing rain lake effect snow or bitter winds sweeping through the elevated train tracks, she would still leave her apartment before dawn, carrying the same canvas shoulder bag and the same determination to arrive at Mercy General on time. Her routine had become almost mechanical. The alarm sounded at 3:45 a.m. Coffee brewed while she packed a simple lunch. She walked 6 blocks to the first bus stop, transferred downtown, walked the final stretch to the hospital. If every connection lined up perfectly, she arrived with 10 minutes to spare. If one bus ran late, the entire morning unraveled. Tuesday tested every ounce of her patience. The first bus never arrived. Passengers stood in silence as the electronic sign changed from 3 minutes to delayed. A man in a heavy winter coat muttered under his breath. A college student repeatedly refreshed the transit app on her phone. An elderly woman leaned against the shelter wall shivering despite 2 scarves wrapped around her neck. Susan glanced at the time. If another bus didn't appear soon, she would be late. Finally, after 22 minutes, a replacement bus pulled to the curb. By then, it was already crowded beyond capacity. She squeezed inside beside the rear door. At the next transfer point, she watched the connecting bus pull away just as she crossed the street. She didn't run. Running on icy sidewalks before a 12-hour nursing shift rarely ended well. Instead, she stood quietly while another 15-minute countdown appeared on the display. When she finally reached Mercy General, she was 12 minutes late. For the first time in nearly 3 years, she hurried through the employee entrance, changed into scrubs in record time, and walked directly toward the nurse's station. Karen Whitmore, the charge nurse that morning, looked up from the assignment board. "There you are." "I'm sorry." Karen checked her watch. 12 minutes. "I know. Everything all right?" "My car finally gave up." Karen nodded sympathetically. "I heard." Susan blinked. "You did. Hospitals are like small towns." She smiled. "News travels faster than ambulances." Susan laughed softly despite herself. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Karen looked almost offended. "Susan." "Yes. In 3 years, you've never once called out because you didn't feel like working. You've covered holidays. You've stayed late without complaining. If being 12 minutes late is your biggest offense," she smiled warmly, "I'd say we're doing all right." Relief washed across Susan. "Thank you." Just go save people. The morning passed at its usual relentless pace. A child recovering from appendicitis refused breakfast until Susan convinced him the pancakes were stronger than superheroes. An elderly woman finally agreed to physical therapy after Susan promised to walk beside her. A middle-aged truck driver thanked her simply for remembering he took his medication with applesauce instead of water. These moments never appeared in annual reports. They never earned awards, yet they quietly filled every shift. Near noon, Susan noticed a familiar face entering the outpatient rehabilitation wing through the corridor windows. Thomas Bennett. He walked slowly with a cane now instead of a walker. Each step remained careful. But the difference from only 2 weeks earlier was remarkable. She instinctively started toward the hallway, then stopped. Thomas had asked the staff to preserve the anonymity of the person who had paid his bill. Approaching him now risked questions neither of them could honestly answer. Instead, she remained where she was. From across the hallway, she watched him smile at the receptionist. He thanked the volunteer who held the door. He even stopped to help another patient pick up papers that had slipped from a folder. Susan smiled to herself. He really wasn't wasting his second chance. Unaware that Susan stood only 30 feet away, Thomas continued toward rehabilitation. Inside the therapy room, another patient sat with folded arms. "I can't do this." Thomas recognized the frustration immediately. He had spoken almost those exact words only days before. He lowered himself carefully into the chair beside the younger man. "Mind if I tell you something?" The patient shrugged. "I suppose." "When I first got here," Thomas tapped his cane lightly. I couldn't walk from that wall to this chair." The younger man looked skeptical. "You?" Thomas nodded. "I apologized every time someone had to help me." "What changed?" Thomas smiled. "A stranger believed I still had tomorrow." The patient frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas reached into his wallet. For a brief second, he considered showing the folded note. Instead, he simply placed his hand over it. "Someone reminded me that surviving isn't the same as living." The therapist called everyone back to exercise. This time, the younger man stood without arguing. Across the hospital, Michael Carter was beginning to hit dead ends. Every inquiry stopped at the same place. Privacy, confidentiality, hospital policy, he respected every answer. Rebecca herself had fiercely defended patient privacy throughout her legal career. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the anonymous donor belonged somewhere within the future of the Second Chance Fund. Not because they deserved praise, because they understood the very purpose Rebecca had hoped the trust would serve. Small interventions, life-changing consequences. Michael spent the afternoon reviewing Rebecca's personal journals, hoping she had left guidance beyond legal documents. Most entries focused on patients she'd met through pro bono work. One story caught his attention. Rebecca described a woman who had nearly lost her apartment because she missed work while caring for a sick child. The amount needed to stabilize her life had been less than 1 month's rent. Rebecca wrote, "People imagine generosity as enormous gifts. Most lives change because someone arrives with exactly enough at exactly the right moment." Michael read the sentence 3 times, exactly enough. Thomas's remaining hospital balance had not been enormous. For a corporation, it was almost insignificant. For one ordinary nurse, he stopped that thought before finishing it. He still had no proof. Back at Mercy General, Susan finally sat down for dinner break nearly 9 hours into her shift. Emily dropped into the chair across from her carrying 2 cups of soup. "I brought an extra." "You didn't have to." "I know." Susan accepted one gratefully. For several minutes they ate in comfortable silence. Finally, Emily asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret helping people so much?" Susan looked puzzled. What makes you ask? Emily stirred her soup slowly. I watch you every day. You stay late. You skip breaks. You remember everyone's names. You give everything. She hesitated. I'm just afraid one day there won't be anything left for you. Susan considered the question carefully. She looked down at the steam rising from the cup between her hands. My mother used to sew, Emily smiled. I didn't know that. She patched clothes instead of throwing them away. When I was little, I asked why she spent so much time fixing other people's coats. What did she say? Susan smiled at the memory. She said, she paused, a coat keeps one person warm, but teaching someone to mend keeps many people warm. Emily nodded slowly. I don't think I understand. Susan looked out the staff lounge window toward the city lights beginning to appear outside. I realized something. What? When you help someone stand again, she smiled softly. So they usually notice the next person who's fallen. Emily sat quietly. Neither woman realized how profoundly true those words would soon become. That same evening, Linda Foster received an email from Michael Carter requesting one final meeting. No legal demands, no subpoenas, no pressure. Only one sentence stood out. I believe the anonymous donor may be essential to fulfilling Rebecca Bennett's final wishes, but I will honor whatever decision you believe is ethically right. Linda leaned back in her chair after reading it. For days, she'd carried the weight of Susan's request for anonymity in one hand and Rebecca's unfinished mission in the other. Now, those two responsibilities no longer felt separate. They had become intertwined. She opened her desk drawer. Inside lay a photocopy of the handwritten note Susan had left in the blue envelope. She unfolded it carefully. You don't owe me. Just don't waste your second chance. Linda whispered the words aloud. Then she made a decision. She would not betray Susan's trust. But she would ask Susan one question. A question that might change not only Susan's life but the future of countless patients neither of them had yet met. Friday morning began with rain instead of snow. Thin drops tapped against the windows of Susan Miller's apartment while she buttoned her navy blue coat and checked the time. 5:11 a.m. She had just enough time to catch the first bus if she left immediately. Before reaching the front door, she noticed an envelope slipped beneath it. For a brief moment, her heart skipped. Blue no. It was only the monthly notice from her landlord reminding tenants about scheduled plumbing maintenance. Susan smiled at herself. Ever since giving away the blue envelope, she seemed to notice every envelope she encountered. She tossed the notice onto the kitchen table and hurried downstairs. The day passed much like the others. Patients came, patients left. Monitors beeped, phones rang. Doctors dictated notes while nurses quietly solved 100 problems no one else ever noticed. Just before 3 o'clock that afternoon, Linda Foster appeared at the nurse's station. Susan. Susan looked up from a patient's chart. Do you have a minute? Of course. Linda rarely interrupted nurses unless something truly required attention. Susan followed her into the finance office. Once the door closed, Linda didn't immediately speak. Instead, she poured 2 cups of coffee from the old machine sitting in the corner. She handed one to Susan. You look tired. Susan laughed. I suppose that's becoming permanent. Linda smiled. I've been thinking about you. Susan looked puzzled. About me? Linda nodded. For almost 2 weeks. The room became quiet. Susan instinctively understood what this conversation was about. Linda folded her hands. I've kept my promise. I know. I haven't told Mr. Bennett. Thank you. I haven't told anyone. Susan smiled gratefully. I appreciate that. Linda hesitated. There is one complication. Susan's expression changed. What happened? Nothing bad. Linda chose each word carefully. A lawyer has been visiting the hospital. Susan frowned. A lawyer? His name is Michael Carter. The name meant nothing to Susan. He represents Thomas Bennett. Susan relaxed slightly. Oh, he isn't looking for money. I never thought he was. He isn't trying to repay anyone. Susan quietly listened. Linda continued. He told me Mr. Bennett believes his life was changed because someone believed he deserved another chance. Susan lowered her eyes. Linda continued softly. There's, something else. He explained why Mr. Bennett matters. For the next 15 minutes, Linda carefully recounted everything Michael had shared about Rebecca Bennett, the unfinished charitable trust, and the legal deadline that had nearly expired, while Thomas disappeared after his sister's death. Susan listened without interrupting. When Linda finished, the office fell completely silent. Finally, Susan spoke. So, she looked down at her coffee. Thomas wasn't the important part. Linda immediately shook her head. No, he was always important. Susan nodded slowly. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. Linda leaned forward. What you did mattered because it saved a man. She paused. What none of us realized was that saving that one man also protected something much larger. Susan absorbed the words quietly. She never imagined her decision had consequences beyond Thomas's recovery. I still don't want him to know. Linda smiled gently. I thought you might say that. Susan looked relieved, but Linda paused. The lawyer asked one question. Susan waited. If the anonymous donor were ever willing, Linda took a careful breath. Would they at least allow him to say thank you? Susan looked toward the office window. Outside, nurses crossed the parking lot carrying umbrellas against the rain. Patients arrived. Families waited. Life continued. I don't need thanks. I know. I really don't. Linda nodded. I believe you. Susan thought for another long moment. My mother used to say, she smiled faintly, gratitude should travel forward. What do you mean? If Thomas wants to thank someone, she looked back at Linda. He should help somebody else. Linda smiled. I had a feeling you'd answer that way. Susan laughed softly. Am I that predictable? In the best possible way. The conversation might have ended there. Instead, Linda reached into her desk drawer. She removed a folded business card. Michael Carter, attorney at law. She placed it gently on the desk between them. He doesn't know your name. Susan looked at the card without touching it. I haven't told him. And you won't? I promised. Linda nodded. I also promised myself something. Susan looked up. What, if there ever came a day when meeting you could help more people than remaining anonymous? She hesitated. And I would ask? Susan remained quiet. I wouldn't force you. I couldn't. But I couldn't ignore the possibility either. Susan finally picked up the business card. She read it once, then set it back down. I need time, Linda smiled. That's all I wanted. That evening, Michael Carter sat alone inside his office, reviewing one final inventory of the Bennett Community Health Trust. Rebecca had documented every intended program in remarkable detail. Emergency discharge assistance, transportation vouchers, temporary medication grants, physical rehabilitation support. One handwritten note had been clipped to the final page. Not every worthy person asks for help. Build a system that notices them anyway. Michael removed his glasses. Rebecca had always written as though she were speaking directly to him. His phone rang. It was Thomas. I had therapy today. How did it go? I walked 43 steps without stopping. Michael smiled. That's wonderful. I counted. I assumed you would. Thomas laughed quietly. I've also been thinking about the stranger. Michael leaned back. So have I. I don't need to know their name. Michael was surprised. You don't? Thomas looked out the window of the church residence where he had recently been offered a temporary room. No. I've decided something. What? If they wanted me to know, they would have told me. Michael remained silent. Thomas continued. But if they ever wanted to meet, I'd like that. Michael nodded to himself. That's fair. I only want one chance. To say what? Thomas reached into his wallet and unfolded the familiar note. I want them to know, his voice became quieter, that they were right. About what? I didn't waste it. After ending the call, Michael stood by his office window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there lived a person who believed kindness should disappear after it was given. Rebecca had believed something slightly different. She believed quiet people sometimes needed to be invited into larger purposes, not because they sought recognition, but because the world desperately needed more people exactly like them. Across town, Susan stepped off the final bus and began the short walk toward her apartment. Rain glistened beneath the streetlights. She was halfway across the parking lot when she noticed a teenage boy helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries upstairs. Neither seemed to know the other very well. The young man simply smiled, carried the bags, and walked away. Susan smiled too. Maybe that was enough. Maybe kindness really did move forward on its own. She unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside. The small kitchen felt unusually peaceful. She had just placed the kettle on the stove when someone knocked. 3 calm, deliberate knocks, not hurried, not hesitant. She frowned. Almost no one visited. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A well-dressed man with silver hair stood quietly in the hallway. In one hand he held a dark umbrella. In the other, a familiar pale blue envelope. Susan's breath caught. She slowly opened the door. The man offered a respectful smile. Miss Susan Miller. Yes. My name is Michael Carter. He lifted the blue envelope slightly. We've been looking for you for almost a month. Susan felt her heartbeat echo in the silence between them. The moment she had believed would never come had finally arrived. For several long seconds, neither Susan Miller nor Michael Carter spoke. The hallway outside Susan's apartment was unusually quiet. Somewhere on the floor below, a television played softly through a closed door. Pipes rattled inside the old building as warm water traveled upward against the winter cold. Susan looked at the pale blue envelope, then at the stranger holding it. Finally, she asked the only question that came to mind. Did I do something wrong? Michael's expression immediately softened. No. You sound very certain. I am. Susan studied him carefully. People who delivered bad news often avoided eye contact. Michael didn't. His eyes carried something else. Respect, relief, perhaps even gratitude. May I come in for a few minutes? He asked. You don't have to decide anything today. I simply believe you deserve to hear a story. Susan hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. It's small. Michael smiled. I've met some of the biggest people in the smallest homes. He removed his shoes just inside the doorway without being asked. Susan noticed. Her mother had always insisted that people who respected someone else's home usually respected the people living there as well. The apartment looked exactly as it always did. Clean, modest. A bookshelf filled with nursing textbooks, novels, and cookbooks. A tiny dining table with 2 mismatched chairs. The old French press drying beside the sink. Michael quietly took everything in. Nothing suggested extravagance. Nothing suggested hidden wealth. Everything suggested careful choices. Susan motioned toward a chair. I'm afraid I don't have much to offer. Coffee? Michael smiled. I'd appreciate that. While the water heated, neither rushed to fill the silence. Susan finally broke it. How did you find me? Michael answered honestly. I didn't. She turned. What do you mean? A number of people helped me. I never asked anyone to violate your privacy. I refused to. Susan relaxed slightly. So, how? Michael smiled. People notice character. Susan looked puzzled. He continued. One person remembered someone who quietly sacrificed. Another remembered someone who never complained. A third remembered someone who treated every patient with unusual dignity. He paused. No one actually told me your story. They simply described someone. Susan handed him a mug of coffee. And, somehow, you arrived here. Michael nodded. I eventually asked whether there happened to be a nurse named Susan. She almost laughed. That's not much of an investigation. It wasn't enough. So I waited. He lifted the blue envelope. Until the person who promised to protect your privacy believed it should become your choice instead. Susan immediately understood. Linda. Michael nodded. She never gave me your address. Susan looked surprised. No, I gave her my card. I asked that if she ever believed speaking with me could help more people than remaining silent. He smiled gently. The decision should belong to you. Susan sat quietly. So you still don't know everything. Michael laughed softly, not even close. She looked at the envelope. What's inside? Nothing valuable. He placed it carefully on the table between them. Please. Susan slowly opened it. Inside, she found only 3 items. A photocopy of the handwritten note she had left for Thomas. A photograph of an elegant woman smiling beside a courthouse. A folded letter. Susan looked first at the photograph. Who is she? Rebecca Bennett. Thomas's sister. Michael nodded. The woman whose dream almost disappeared. Susan unfolded the letter. The handwriting was graceful, deliberate, unmistakably written by someone accustomed to drafting legal documents. The letter wasn't addressed to Susan. It had been written years earlier. To whoever someday helps this work continue. Never assume the people who save the most lives wear the finest suits or sign the largest checks. Watch instead for the quiet ones. The people who stay after everyone else leaves. The people who solve problems before anyone notices they exist. The people willing to sacrifice comfort so someone else can keep hope. If you find such a person, invite them. Not because they seek recognition, because the people we trust with compassion should first understand sacrifice. Susan lowered the page slowly. She wrote this. Michael nodded. During her final year. Susan stared at the words again. It feels... She searched for the right expression. Personal. It does. Michael folded his hands. I've represented charitable foundations for almost 3 decades. I've met extraordinary donors. I've met generous corporations. I've met remarkable philanthropists. He paused. I've also met people who gave because they wanted to be remembered. Susan remained silent. Michael continued. Then I heard about a nurse who emptied years of savings, asked no one to know, and quietly returned to work. Susan looked uncomfortable. I only paid a bill. Michael gently shook his head. No. You preserved a future. She frowned. I didn't even know about the trust. I know. That's exactly why this matters. Michael opened Rebecca's trust folder. He showed Susan several pages outlining the Second Chance Fund, emergency transportation, discharge assistance, medication support, temporary rehabilitation. Each section contained handwritten notes in Rebecca's own handwriting. She believed most people don't lose hope because of one enormous obstacle. Michael pointed to another sentence. They lose hope after 10 smaller ones arrive together. Susan read quietly. Then she whispered. She understood. Very much. Michael smiled. So do you. Susan shook her head. I'm just a nurse. Michael smiled even more warmly. No, you're a nurse. There's a difference. She looked away, embarrassed. My job is to help people. And you did. No. I did what anyone should do. Michael's voice became softer. I've interviewed more than 200 trustees over my career. Would you like to know something? Susan nodded cautiously. Most people say exactly the opposite. She looked puzzled. They tell me why they're uniquely qualified. They list accomplishments. They describe leadership. He smiled. You've spent this entire conversation explaining why you shouldn't be special. Susan laughed awkwardly. Because I'm not. Michael looked directly into her eyes. Rebecca would have liked you. The room fell silent again. Those simple words carried unexpected weight. Susan glanced toward the kitchen window where rain continued sliding slowly down the glass. My mother used to say, she smiled faintly. The best compliments usually belong to people we'll never meet. Michael nodded. I think your mother and Rebecca would have gotten along. Susan carefully placed Rebecca's letter back inside the envelope. What happens now? Michael took a slow breath. That depends entirely on you. She waited. I didn't come here to repay you. I didn't come with a check. I didn't come offering ownership. Susan looked relieved. Good, he smiled. I suspected you'd say that. So, why are you here? Michael slid one final document across the table. Not a contract, not an employment agreement, simply an invitation. Volunteer Advisory Member Second Chance Fund. Susan stared at it. I don't understand. Rebecca insisted that at least one advisor should come from direct patient care. Michael explained. Not administration, not finance. Someone who understands what patients actually need. We've searched for months. He smiled gently. I think Thomas accidentally found that person. Susan looked stunned. You want me? We'd like to invite you. You'll receive no salary. No title that impresses people. No publicity. She almost smiled. You've clearly done your homework. Michael laughed. What you will receive. He looked toward Rebecca's photograph. So is the opportunity to help shape how this fund reaches people before small crises become life-changing disasters. Susan didn't answer immediately. Her eyes wandered around her tiny apartment. The cracked window, the worn dining table, the stack of unpaid utility bills tucked beneath a cookbook. Her own life still required careful budgeting. She still rode buses before sunrise. She still didn't know how she'd repair her car, yet somehow she found herself imagining a frightened patient sitting alone in a hospital room, one unexpected bill away from giving up. Finally, she spoke. I have one condition. Michael smiled. I hoped you would. Thomas must never feel like he owes me. He won't. I want him to believe exactly what I wrote. You don't owe me. Michael finished the sentence quietly. Just don't waste your second chance. Susan nodded, and if I accept, she looked toward Rebecca's photograph. I want every person we help to feel the same way. Michael's smile widened. At that moment, he became certain he hadn't simply found the anonymous donor. He had found the person Rebecca Bennett had been describing years before she ever knew Susan Miller existed. Susan did not answer Michael Carter that evening. Not because she doubted the mission. Not because she questioned Rebecca Bennett's vision. She simply understood the weight of saying yes. Some invitations changed a calendar. Others quietly redirected an entire life. "I need a little time," she said as she carefully returned Rebecca's letter to the blue envelope. Michael smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. You were—" The people who answer immediately usually fall into two groups. Susan looked curious. Which groups? Those who want recognition, and those who don't yet understand the responsibility. Susan folded her hands around her coffee mug. And the people who ask for time, they usually understand exactly how much is at stake. Michael stood buttoning his overcoat. "I'll be in my office every day." He slid a business card across the table. "No pressure. No deadline tonight. Just one request." Susan looked up. "What is it?" "Meet Thomas." She hesitated. "He still doesn't know." "I know. He doesn't need to know who paid his hospital bill." Michael nodded. "Then don't tell him." She frowned slightly. "Why would I meet him?" "Because I think both of you need to see what hope looks like after it survives." With that, Michael thanked her for the coffee and quietly left. Susan stood at the apartment window watching him disappear beneath a black umbrella into the rainy Chicago evening. The blue envelope remained on the kitchen table long after he was gone. She touched it only once before going to bed. The following morning began as every other morning had since her car broke down. The alarm rang before 4. Coffee, bus, transfer, another walk through icy streets. Yet something felt different. Rebecca's letter lingered in her thoughts. Not every worthy person asks for help. Build a system that notices them anyway. She repeated the sentence almost unconsciously while waiting for the first bus. An elderly man standing beside her struggled to scan his transit card. The machine rejected it twice. Without thinking, Susan stepped forward. "Try holding it a little longer." He smiled. "Technology and I aren't friends." The card beeped successfully. "There you go." "Thank you." As Susan took her own seat near the back of the bus, she smiled to herself. Rebecca had been right. Most people didn't need dramatic rescues. Sometimes they simply needed someone to notice. Mercy General was unusually busy that Saturday. A pileup on Interstate 90 had filled several trauma rooms overnight. Susan spent the first 4 hours moving almost non-stop between patients. Near noon, she finally sat for 5 minutes with a paper cup of soup. Emily Ross dropped into the chair beside her. "You look distracted." "I've been thinking." "About—" Susan hesitated. "If someone asked you to help more people?" Emily laughed. "I'd assume it was another overtime shift." Susan smiled. "No. I mean, outside work." Emily studied her carefully. "Something happened." "A lawyer visited me." Emily nearly dropped her spoon. "A lawyer?" Susan nodded. "It's a long story. I've got 5 minutes." Susan quietly told her everything except one detail. She never admitted she was the anonymous donor. Instead, she simply explained Rebecca Bennett's trust and the invitation to serve on its advisory board. When she finished, Emily sat in silence. Finally, she asked, "So why are you hesitating?" Susan looked surprised. "You think I should do it?" Emily almost laughed. "I think you're already doing it." "What do you mean?" "You've spent years helping one patient at a time." Emily smiled warmly. "Maybe this is just a way to help the next 100. The afternoon passed quickly. Late in the shift, Linda Foster stopped Susan outside the medication room. "I heard he met you." Susan smiled. "He did. How did it go?" "I don't think I've ever met a lawyer who talked less about law." Linda laughed. "That's Michael." Susan became thoughtful. "Did you know Rebecca?" "Only professionally." Linda leaned against the wall. "But I remember one thing." "What?" She once told me. Linda closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the conversation. Compassion should never depend on whether someone filled out paperwork correctly. Susan smiled. She sounds remarkable. She was. Linda hesitated. Have you made your decision? Not yet. Linda nodded. I wasn't asking to pressure you. I know. I was asking because... She smiled softly. I think Rebecca would have been very patient. That evening, Susan decided to visit the small rehabilitation center where Thomas continued outpatient therapy. Michael had arranged the meeting. Thomas knew only that someone from the hospital wished to speak with him. Nothing more. Susan arrived wearing ordinary clothes instead of scrubs. She wanted no reminder of hospital hierarchy. Thomas sat near a window reading his leather notebook. When he looked up, recognition crossed his face immediately. Nurse Susan, she smiled. It's good to see you walking. He carefully stood. It's good to be able to. They shook hands. Neither mentioned the blue envelope. Neither mentioned the hospital bill. Instead, they talked, for nearly an hour, about Chicago winters, about woodworking, about nursing, about Rebecca. Thomas described his sister with quiet admiration. She believed laws should protect dignity. Susan listened carefully. Then Thomas asked, Can I tell you something strange? Of course. I don't know who paid my bill. Susan's heartbeat quickened. But every morning, he reached into his wallet. I read this. He unfolded the now laminated note. Susan froze. She hadn't expected that. The paper had been professionally sealed in clear plastic. The creases were gone. The handwriting remained. You don't owe me. Just don't waste your second chance. I had it laminated, Thomas said almost sheepishly. I was afraid I'd wear it out. Susan smiled gently. I think whoever wrote it would be honored. Thomas looked toward the window. I've been trying. I know. You do. I've heard wonderful things. Thomas laughed quietly. I still get tired walking. So, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough. Susan thought for a moment. Then she asked, Do you remember the young man in therapy who wanted to quit? Thomas nodded. I spoke with him. I heard. He finished his exercises because of you. Thomas looked surprised. I didn't do much. You noticed him. She smiled. Sometimes that's enough. Thomas stared again at the laminated note. I've decided something. What? One day, he folded it carefully back into his wallet. When I'm stronger, I want to volunteer. Susan's eyes brightened. Wherever people feel forgotten. You've experienced that. He nodded. I don't want anyone else to. Susan suddenly understood something profound. The second chance had already begun multiplying. Not through money, through people. 3 days later, Susan walked into Michael Carter's office carrying the blue envelope. He looked up from his desk. I had a feeling I'd see you today. She smiled. I met Thomas, and he doesn't know it was me. He never has to. She placed the envelope on his desk. I've made my decision. Michael waited quietly. Susan took a slow breath. I'll join the Second Chance Fund, but only if we never measure success by how much money we spend. Michael smiled. Then how? She looked toward Rebecca's framed photograph hanging on the wall. We measure it by how many people no longer feel invisible. Michael slowly stood and extended his hand. Instead of shaking it immediately, Susan looked once more at Rebecca's picture. Then she smiled. I think she'd expect us to get to work. Michael laughed. I think she would. Outside the office, Thomas was finishing another rehabilitation session. He walked a little farther than the day before, a little steadier, a little stronger. Without realizing it, the man who had once believed his story was ending had just become the first volunteer of a mission that would soon offer thousands of strangers The same quiet promise folded inside a simple blue envelope. Spring arrived in Chicago almost unnoticed. The piles of gray snow that had lined the streets for months slowly disappeared beneath longer afternoons, and the first patches of green pushing through the frozen ground. The air no longer stung quite as sharply during Susan Miller's walk from the bus stop to Mercy General. She was still taking public transportation. Her Corolla remained parked outside her apartment building, waiting for repairs she still hadn't been able to afford. Oddly enough, she no longer glanced at it every morning with frustration. It had become a reminder instead. Every difficult beginning could eventually become part of someone else's hope. 3 evenings each week after finishing 12-hour nursing shifts, Susan crossed downtown to a modest office on the 6th floor of an old brick building. A small brass plaque beside the entrance read, "The Bennett Community Health Trust." No marble lobby. No expensive furniture. No polished corporate image. Just 4 offices, 1 conference room, a donated coffee maker, and people determined to make limited resources matter as much as possible. Rebecca Bennett would have approved. The first advisory meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Around the table sat Michael Carter, 2 physicians who had volunteered their expertise, a retired social worker named Janet Alvarez, an accountant named David Monroe, and Susan. Michael opened the meeting by placing Rebecca's original mission statement in the center of the table. Instead of beginning with budgets or legal updates, he quietly read the first paragraph aloud. "We believe dignity should never depend on wealth. We believe timely compassion prevents deeper suffering. We believe small interventions wisely given create lasting change." When he finished, no one spoke immediately. The words carried the kind of weight that made silence feel respectful rather than uncomfortable. Michael looked toward Susan. "You've spent more time with patients in crisis than any of us. What do you think should come first?" Susan didn't answer right away. She looked at the folders stacked before her. Inside each one was a real person. Not statistics, not applications, lives. "I think we've been asking the wrong question." Michael smiled. "What question should we ask instead? We usually ask," she glanced around the room, "who deserves help?" Everyone nodded. "I think we should ask," she paused, "what small obstacle is keeping this person from standing on their own again?" Janet leaned forward. "Explain." Susan opened the first file. "A single father recovering from heart surgery." She pointed to the notes. "He's medically ready to work in 6 weeks. The problem isn't treatment. It's transportation to physical therapy." She looked up. "A monthly bus pass costs less than 1 emergency room visit." The physician beside her nodded thoughtfully. She opened another folder. "An elderly woman skipped blood pressure medication because she couldn't afford both medicine and electricity." David quietly calculated numbers. "The medication would cost less than replacing 1 damaged hospital bed." Susan smiled gently. "Exactly." She wasn't interested in rescuing people forever. She wanted to remove the one stone that kept them from walking forward. By the end of the meeting, the board unanimously approved a new guideline. Every request would begin with one simple question. What is the smallest intervention with the greatest chance of restoring independence? Michael later admitted it completely changed how he viewed charitable work. Weeks passed. The Second Chance Fund quietly began operating. No newspaper announced its opening. No television cameras arrived. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony. Only ordinary people quietly receiving opportunities at exactly the right moment. One afternoon, a young waitress named Carla nearly missed chemotherapy because her transmission failed. The fund paid for temporary transportation. 3 months later, she completed treatment and returned to work. A retired veteran needed a walker that Medicare would not approve for another 6 weeks. The fund purchased it within 48 hours. He avoided another dangerous fall. A college student recovering from spinal surgery needed prescription medication for only 18 days before insurance coverage resumed. The fund filled the gap. 18 days, that was all. Yet, without those 18 days, his recovery might have been permanently delayed. Susan insisted on reviewing every application personally. Not because she distrusted anyone, because paperwork rarely told the whole story. Whenever possible, she asked one additional question. What are you trying to get back to? The answers were rarely dramatic. My daughter's graduation, my job, my church choir, my grandson, my garden, my classroom. People almost never dreamed about becoming rich. Most simply wanted their ordinary lives back. Thomas Bennett became the Trust's first official volunteer. His rehabilitation had progressed steadily. He still carried a cane on longer walks, but his confidence had returned. Every Tuesday morning, he visited Mercy General's rehabilitation wing. Not as a patient, as a volunteer. He greeted frightened newcomers, helped people complete forms, pushed wheelchairs when staff became overwhelmed. Most importantly, he listened. One afternoon, a middle-aged mechanic sat staring at discharge papers. I can't afford another week off work. Thomas quietly pulled up a chair. I understand. You don't. Thomas smiled. I once believed everything I owned fit inside one plastic hospital bag. The mechanic looked at him. What changed? Thomas reached into his wallet. The laminated note remained there. He no longer unfolded it every day. He no longer needed to. Its words had already settled into his heart. Instead of showing it, he simply repeated the sentence from memory. You don't owe me. The mechanic frowned. What? Thomas smiled. Just don't waste your second chance. The man sat quietly. Something in those words eased the panic in his face. Across the room, a physical therapist noticed the conversation. Later, she told Susan about it. Susan smiled to herself. Thomas had begun passing the message forward exactly as she'd hoped. One Friday evening, Michael invited the advisory board to review the Trust's first quarterly report. Everyone expected financial summaries. Instead, he projected photographs onto the conference room wall. Not of donors, not of board members, of empty chairs. The first image showed a dialysis chair, unused because a patient no longer needed emergency treatment after receiving medication in time. The second showed an emergency room bed, empty because another patient avoided hospitalization altogether. The third showed an ambulance bay. Michael turned toward the group. Do you know what these pictures represent? Silence. They represent crises that never happened. Susan smiled. She understood immediately. The greatest success often looked invisible. You couldn't photograph suffering that had been prevented. You couldn't count tears that were never shed. Michael clicked to the final slide. A simple chart. In the Trust's first 4 months, 73 patients assisted. 91% completed recommended treatment. 84% returned to work or independent living within 3 months. Average assistance per person, $642. The room remained silent. Finally, David spoke. I've worked in finance for 20 years. I've never seen numbers this meaningful. Susan looked down at Rebecca's mission statement lying beside her notebook. Exactly enough, at exactly the right moment. Michael noticed where her eyes had settled. I think she'd be proud. Susan shook her head gently. I hope she'd be proud of all of us. Late that evening, after everyone else left, Susan remained in the conference room organizing files. Thomas knocked lightly on the open door. You still working? She smiled. I thought volunteers went home before board members. He laughed. I brought something. He handed her a small cardboard box. Inside were dozens of pale blue envelopes. Susan looked surprised. "You bought these?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I made them." She looked closer. Each envelope had been carefully folded by hand from heavy blue stationery. Perfectly aligned, perfectly measured. "You made all of these. I remembered how to measure." He smiled. "My hands still aren't steady enough for staircases." He gently touched one envelope. "But I can still build something." Susan felt her eyes grow warm. They weren't just envelopes anymore. They had become symbols. Every one represented another person who might receive exactly enough hope to keep moving. She picked one up carefully. "It looks beautiful." Thomas smiled. So did the first one. Susan looked at him. He still didn't know. He simply believed the unknown stranger had changed his life. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps some truths became even more meaningful when they belonged to everyone rather than one individual. As Susan locked the office that night, she carried the box of handmade blue envelopes beneath her arm. She had no way of knowing that, before long, one of those envelopes would find its way into the hands of a young hospital aide whose quiet act of compassion would complete the circle that had begun months earlier with one anonymous gift. Nearly 1 year after the rainy morning when a lawyer first knocked on Susan Miller's apartment door, Mercy General Hospital looked much the same. The automatic doors still opened every few seconds. Ambulances still arrived without warning. Families still filled waiting rooms with whispered prayers and anxious hope. Yet, beneath the ordinary rhythm of the hospital, something had quietly changed. Not everyone knew the name of the Bennett Community Health Trust. Most patients never would. They simply discovered that somehow one impossible obstacle had disappeared at exactly the right moment. A prescription was covered. A rehabilitation appointment became possible. A temporary hotel room was arranged while a child received treatment. No speeches, no ceremonies, just another chance. Susan still worked the same nursing shifts. She had refused promotions that would have taken her away from bedside care. Michael had once asked why. She smiled before answering. "If I stop seeing patients one day, I'll stop understanding them." Michael had never asked again. The trust had grown carefully, not rapidly, not recklessly. Rebecca Bennett's guiding principle remained unchanged. Help people stand. Don't carry them forever. One warm September afternoon, Susan finished checking on a patient recovering from pneumonia when she noticed a familiar young face in the hallway. Olivia Grant, 24 years old, a newly hired nursing assistant. Hardworking, quiet, always the first to volunteer when another employee needed help. Susan had noticed her months earlier for one simple reason. Olivia spoke to every patient before touching a chart. "What would you like me to call you?" It was such a small question. Yet Susan knew exactly how much dignity could fit inside those words. That afternoon, Olivia looked unusually distracted. She checked her watch 3 times within a minute, then disappeared toward the hospital finance office. An hour later, Linda Foster quietly called Susan. "Do you have a moment?" Susan walked into the familiar office where nearly a year earlier she had placed her life savings inside a blue envelope. Linda closed the door gently. "I think you should see something." She pointed toward the hallway. Through the partially open blinds, Susan saw Olivia speaking softly with an elderly man. His wife sat beside him in a wheelchair. The woman looked exhausted. The man repeatedly shook his head. "We can't." Olivia quietly answered something they couldn't hear. Then she disappeared into Linda's office. 5 minutes later, she returned carrying a receipt. The elderly man's shoulders began trembling. His wife reached for his hand. They both started crying. Susan looked at Linda. "What happened?" Linda smiled. "Olivia paid the remaining balance." Susan blinked. From her own money, Linda nodded. She'd been saving for graduate school. For several seconds, Susan couldn't speak. The scene unfolding before her looked hauntingly familiar. Different faces, the same quiet courage. Later that evening, Susan found Olivia sitting alone in the employee cafeteria eating yogurt and crackers. She carried 2 cups of coffee to the table. "Mind if I join you?" Olivia smiled nervously. "Of course." For a while, they simply talked about work, the difficult patients, long shifts, learning new procedures. "Oh," finally, Susan asked gently, "I heard about the couple." Olivia looked down immediately. "I hope I didn't break any rules." "No, I just—" She searched for the words. "They reminded me of my grandparents." Susan nodded. "I understand." Olivia smiled awkwardly. "It probably wasn't very smart." "What makes you say that?" "I've been saving for nursing school." She laughed softly. "So now it'll take longer." Susan looked at the young woman across from her. She recognized something instantly. Not sacrifice. Peace. The quiet peace that sometimes arrived after making a difficult choice for the right reason. "Do you regret it?" Olivia answered without hesitation. "No," Susan smiled. "I didn't think you would." The following Tuesday, after finishing rehabilitation volunteer work, Thomas Bennett stopped by the trust office carrying another small cardboard box. Inside were newly folded blue envelopes. He had made hundreds by then, each one folded by hand, each one carefully measured. Susan thanked him. Before leaving, Thomas asked, "Would you walk with me?" They crossed the small park behind the office building. Children chased one another across the grass. Office workers ate lunch beneath the trees. Chicago looked gentler than either of them remembered. Thomas finally spoke. "You know." "What?" "I've been thinking about the person who helped me." Susan smiled quietly. "I imagine you have." "I don't wonder who they are anymore." She looked at him. "You don't?" He shook his head. "For a long time I believed gratitude meant finding someone." He paused. "Now I think gratitude means becoming someone." Susan felt her eyes grow warm. Thomas continued walking slowly with his cane. "I'll probably never know their name." "No, but maybe I don't need to." Susan looked toward the skyline. Maybe not. Back at Mercy General the following week, Michael Carter arrived carrying the Trust's annual report. The board had gathered to celebrate its first year. No fancy banquet, just sandwiches, coffee, and handwritten notes from patients whose lives had quietly changed. One letter came from the waitress whose chemotherapy transportation had been covered. Another came from the veteran who had avoided another fall. A third arrived from a single father who wrote, "You didn't save my life. You saved the ordinary life my children deserve to have with me." Michael finished reading the letters and looked around the room. No balance sheet could ever measure this. Everyone nodded. Before the meeting ended, Susan stood. "I have one proposal." The room grew quiet. She reached into the cardboard box Thomas had brought. Then she placed one handmade blue envelope in front of every board member. "I think these should never contain checks." Michael looked surprised. "What should they contain?" Susan smiled. "Only one sentence." Everyone already knew which one. David quietly read it aloud. "You don't owe me." Janet finished the rest. "Just don't waste your second chance." No one suggested changing a single word. 2 days later, Susan visited Mercy General before her shift. She stopped beside Olivia's locker. Without saying anything, she placed one handmade blue envelope inside. There was no money, only a handwritten note. Olivia opened it during lunch. She smiled as tears quietly filled her eyes. No signature appeared beneath the message. She didn't need one. That afternoon, an elderly patient dropped his meal tray in the hallway. Before anyone could call for housekeeping, Olivia knelt beside him. "It's all right," she said gently. "We'll clean it up together." Thomas happened to be volunteering nearby. He watched silently. Then, without interrupting, he smiled to himself. The circle had become complete. Months later, visitors entering the Bennett Community Health Trust office often noticed a simple wooden shelf near the entrance. On it rested dozens of handmade blue envelopes. No names, no donor recognition, no plaques, just envelopes. When people asked what they meant, Susan always gave the same answer. They remind us that hope doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes folded inside one quiet decision. Years passed. The Corolla was eventually repaired. Susan finally finished paying off her student loans. Thomas continued volunteering until his health no longer allowed long days. Michael remained the trust's legal advisor. Olivia became a registered nurse. Every new employee learned the story of the blue envelope. Not the names, not the identities, only the lesson. One ordinary act of compassion had reached one stranger. That stranger had protected another woman's lifelong dream. That dream had become a trust. That trust had restored thousands of ordinary lives. And every one of those lives carried the possibility of becoming someone else's second chance. Kindness is often misunderstood because we measure it by its size instead of its timing. The truth is that the most powerful act of compassion is not always the largest gift. Sometimes it is simply arriving at the exact moment when another person has almost given up. Susan never imagined that paying one hospital bill would create a chain of hope reaching people she would never meet. She acted because someone in front of her needed help, not because she expected recognition. That is what real generosity looks like. It asks for nothing but leaves everything changed. Perhaps each of us carries a blue envelope in a different form. It may be our time, our patience, our encouragement, our skills, or simply our willingness to notice someone everyone else has overlooked. We may never see the full impact of those choices, and that's all right. Not every seed grows where the one who planted it can watch. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us about a moment when someone's small kindness changed your life, or when you became someone else's second chance. If stories like this remind you that compassion still exists in the world, please share this video with someone who needs hope today and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that celebrate the quiet courage of ordinary people.